What's happening, everybody? Welcome to this guest episode of Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I'm Dan Besbris, and we'll be joined in just a matter of moments by Yahoo Fantasy's Dan Titus, just a few short days after a board update that went on over at Yahoo Fantasy Sports. We'll get Dan's new favorite targets on the board and a look at his 9-cat mock results from the slow draft that I put together a couple of weeks ago. Before we get to that, I want to remind all of you guys that this show is brought to you by Bet Online, the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football, although in a few days it'll be basketball. Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during games. Think you know your stuff? Get in on a $200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of $200,000. And when the game's over, head to the online casino, get in on some blackjack or poker, or unwind with one of over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Bet Online. The game starts here. You can find me on social media at Dan Besbris. You can find the network at Old Man Squad on Twitter. That one will follow you back, and it'll also make sure that you know any of the other stuff going on from our other hosts. And you can also follow on Instagram. I think the internet just doinked out on me for a second. Make sure to hit like, comment, do whatever you got to do to get this thing into whatever algorithm. Subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify. It is if that's your thing. And now we've made you guys wait long enough. Let's get to our guest, the great Dan Titus. Technology overwhelms me sometimes, but I think I mostly figured out this weird little jump cut for video. That's not the right word either. But anyway, Dan, what's up, dude? It's good to talk to you again.
You too, Dan. I didn't realize I messed up. So you have the @ handle before the name. I put mine after, or vice versa, whatever. So I'll update that for next time. But good to see you, Dan. Happy Friday. We're almost at basketball season. We're under 30 days. So yeah, man. We're under 20 days.
Under 20. Yeah, I was gonna say we're at 18 right now.
Yeah.
It is real tight. And I have so many episodes of this show that I still have like this list of things I wanted to get. I don't think I'm gonna get to all of them. Unless, do you think I could just like put my family in a hotel for the next 18 days? Is that
Can we arrange that? Is that possible? Yeah, it's called hey, wife, I bought you and the kids a vacation. I'm just going to send you down the street. It's not going to be as lavish as we're used to, but you know.
Yeah, it's called a Motel 6. You guys ever heard of it? Tom Bodette will lead the light on for you. All right, so I thought we'd have a couple kind of fun things to talk about. The initial plan was to talk to the great Dan Titus at Dan Titus on social. And I actually mentioned before I brought you in, you are, of course, with Yahoo Fantasy Basketball, which is perfect timing because you guys had a new board drop earlier this week. I mean, really, this is like when a new album drops, man. This is a big deal. The new board is out, and so I added in a new topic to talk about with you today, which is some of the big leapers on this one. And, you know, there was a lot of like minor shuffles in there, but I got to say, Dan, before I even bug you about an individual player, a lot of the guys I liked are going sooner. So I'm kind of upset with you right now.
I mean, that kind of happens like the more you draft. And I think now as we're getting closer to training camp, like it started officially, we had a game today. Things are going to move. Things are going to change. And I think now that the most difficult part of doing rankings ahead of training camp is you're kind of just guessing on certain scenarios and rotations. And then a big trade happens in the midst of all of this to kind of change everything. So yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of on the fly pivoting, and I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see more change. Just look at how reports keep coming out and things happen. So yeah, I'm sorry the value is being lost in some, but where some value is lost, I'm sure there's some value gained as well.
So I'm going to clump together a few names for the first one, but I want to hit on a few key guys that are a little bit farther down the board. Up at the top of the board, there were actually a few kind of big shifts. I mean, Cat was one of them. That was an expected one because of the trade. And I am curious, by the way, Dan, your thoughts on the outcome there. It feels like by the way the board moved that you're positive on it. But also, we had a pretty big drop from Kevin Durant. and a pretty good jump from James Harden. The Harden one, I was sort of able, okay, now that we got the Kawhi news, that's like maybe he will, maybe he won't kind of thing.
Right.
Why the Kevin Durant drop, if you don't mind my asking?
Yeah, I think it's partially something that we talked about earlier in the season or early in the offseason was how are we ranking players that are getting up there in age but had pretty active off seasons. And Kevin Durant went into the Paris Olympics with a calf injury, played by all accounts really well, didn't come out with anything of concern. But I think the one thing is concerning is that Bradley Beal's actually healthy to start the season. They also brought in Tyus Jones. Mike Budenholzer also tends to play his players a little bit less than the previous coaching staff, just based from his history in Milwaukee. So I kind of downgraded quite a few of the Suns. I just think that, the most drastic one was Kevin Durant. And I think it's mainly because he balled out last year and he balls out every year. He can get his shot whenever he wants. But if everyone's healthy, is that less shots to go around? Is that less? Maybe does assists go up? But I just think the usage isn't going to be as prominent as it was last year. So me docking him, from, what is it, 14 to like a 19, not a substantial drop. He's still a second round pick. But last year he was a, consensus first round pick. So I think it's been a continual slide or trend of a continued slide for me all season long, just because his health, or excuse me, his age is getting higher, and also the usage is probably going down. So not a huge downgrade, but still a downgrade nonetheless.
Kawhi down to 48. It sounds like then you're not expecting him to be ready to start the year.
No, and partially because I had him as a third round pick before, which I thought was fair given that his injury history is baked into his ADP. But now, because he's so vocal and so honest about, I gotta load manage here to make it to the end of the season, he's telling you he's telling you the honest truth. So that rate, like, I feel like if I can account for 60 games, I got to discount that somewhere. And it's not that he's not a first round talent and has proven to be, he is, but you're not playing 20 something games a year. Potentially that's going to hurt your fantasy value overall. So I didn't move him down too far. Like, he went from a mid third to an early fourth, but I think fourth round is more appropriate given what we know about his injury concerns.
Maybe the biggest jump in this most recent board belongs to Colin Sexton, who jumped from 118 to 76. You mentioned off air that may get course corrected a little bit, but why the big, temporary at least, move on Sexton?
Yeah, so digging into his numbers after he became a starter, he was pretty much like he was a seventh round value for much of the season after that. Started over 50 games. And I can't help but notice that I think that the Utah Jazz has played better when he's in that starting role. And so if you have a starting point guard in Keontae George, you got to have an efficient shooter next to him. That's pretty much what Colin Sexton was last year. He shot over 48% from the field. His three ball was definitely improved. And I think this is him kind of getting better and kind of getting back to where he was right after that 2021, 2022 season, I believe, where he kind of made that substantial jump in his scoring and his assists. He really just had the breakout campaign. This guy isn't that old. So, like, he had to just go into a new environment, find his footing. And I think he's finally done that. Being that there's so many veterans on the Utah Jazz, I think that they're going to prioritize trading John Collins and Jordan Clarkson first. And then after that, I think you'll kind of just build with that kind of young core there, with Colin Sexton probably being one of the elder statesmen of that actual squad, being that they're pretty much in a rebuild mode. So, I like Colin Sexton. He's an efficient guard that you can get that I think can provide, top 75 value in the course of the season if he's starting, which I'm projecting him to do.
Two or three more names before we get into your mock results. Bogdan Bogdanovic up from 108 to 78. He actually started, I think the first board he was at 86. So it's kind of like he went down. Now he's rebounded back a little bit. I completely agree, by the way, with the new spot on him. I'm not super thrilled about it because now I don't feel like he gets much value with it. But why the big jump up for Bogdan?
I think he's going to start the two. And if he's starting again, I think that's just more opportunity for him to shine. There isn't, with DeJounte Murray going out, some of that usage is definitely going to go to Jalen Johnson, who was a breakout last year, had a mini breakout last year. I think I would have called it a full breakout if he lasted more games, only played like 57. But I think at this point, Bogey proved that he's going to be a top option in this offense. And for what he brings, scoring threes with the right build, I think he's an excellent pickup in the mid rounds of drafts for what he can provide and what we can see and what he proved last year. I mean, he was like a 6th round, 7th round value last year. And for him to be his ADP to be in the hundreds, that didn't make any sense when only his role was going to expand, not go back. So the Hawks have an interesting cap situation. So I'm curious about like who they're going to move. DeAndre Hunter's been on the block forever. Obviously, there's Clint Capella in an expiring deal. But I think Bogdanovic is also one of those guys who has that, like, I don't love your contract, but I think for what the Hawks need to kind of compete, they need his offense. So I think he'll actually stay or outlast the other two, who wouldn't surprise me if they're moved at some point early in the season by midseason.
Two more names. One of them you mentioned to me before we started, and that's Jordan Poole, who's up from 98 to 79. Is this because it sounds like he's going to be running point for that team?
Yeah, that's exactly why. I had Malcolm Brogdon pretty high, like, for Malcolm Brogdon, like in the hundreds, because I thought that he would at least be around enough to, like, stifle some of that usage rate or, potential assist for Jordan Poole playing on the wing. But I mean, Jordan Poole played a lot of point guard towards the back end of that season. And he was, if you held on long enough, someone that could have helped you win a championship. So taking that energy into the next year, now that he's already been anointed the starting role, I mean, the assist potential there for me is the biggest gain. He might still have efficiency woes, but I mean, he's proven to be a viable fantasy option when he's been a starter. So in the point guard role, I should say specifically. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not going to probably go too much higher than 70 because I think that bakes in the upside that, hey, maybe he could be 60, top 60 or something. But there's also the chance that he reverts back to who he was last year. And, we see a more of a top 150 guy than, a top 70. So, but I think this is a good start for him going into a bounce back campaign.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you don't have to spend a 40 range pick on him this year. So it's a heck of a lot easier to swallow that pill if it doesn't go as well. Last big leaper I wanted to ask you about was OG Anunoby up to 81. He was at 109 previously. Was there news? Was this related to the trade, or was this just more of like, I should probably get that guy a little higher?
So the problem I have with OG is the availability.
Right.
The on-court play has always been solid, and I think especially with the New York Knicks, like his impact on winning in real life, to me, translate pretty well in fantasy because he's just being asked. His role is so specific as a defensive stopper and a corner three catch and shoot guy, where I feel like he could actually have the season that we always expect Mikal Bridges to have, where he's just going to get a lot of stocks, be that 3-and-D wing that can also, score some points, get some rebounds, et cetera, and shoot, pretty strong percentages. The one downside to OG is his free throw percentage, but I think that can normalize to around 70 something, mid 70s, something like that. But yeah, me moving him up was more about, once the Cat trade happened, their depth got depleted a little bit. I think that there's an opportunity where Tibbs could mess around with the lineups, and as long as he's starting and he's healthy, he's going to see 30 minutes. So I think even if he gets hurt at some point, his immediate impact in fantasy will be that of a top 75 player. Even though I have him at 80, that's building in some cannibalism of, Mikal Bridges taking some usage, Karl-Anthony Towns taking some usage, but him also just being really just a stock specialist. And I have OG and Alex Caruso pretty tightly ranked together because I think that they're both going to have their strong suits and how their specialties in stocks will boost your fantasy team.
We're talking to Dan Titus of Yahoo Fantasy. This, for those that are watching, is a very small, now let me zoom in a little bit, look at Dan's, team from our 9-cat industry mock. This was a roto mock. Before we go through your players, I've been asking everybody that's come on the show this same question, which is, how different was your team here with it being roto versus head-to-head, and how much? Okay, I gotta figure out the right way to phrase it though. Do you feel like you drafted this team like this more so because it was roto, or more so because it was games cap, or was it kind of a blend of the two?
More because it was roto. So in roto, I think you can take more risks with the injury prone type players because even though they're, they may miss games here and there, their general floor is probably higher than most just because you're getting like an all-star caliber player that comes with some warts. But I think that roto kind of helps you balance that out. I think my team is actually pretty deep. I came out Not really loving my initial build because I had so much risk built into it. But because it's Roto, I felt way better about it. Like if this was head to head, I would have been cooked by like, mid season, like praying like, God, can you guys just get off of IL? But I think that you can, if I start out and all these guys are healthy, which they are for the most part, I think I would have gotten to a pretty good head start in terms of a balanced roster.
Dan's team, by the way, I'm going to read it from start to finish, and we'll kind of go through this thing in chunks. You had the number 4 pick, and as basically all 4 picks are these days, you started with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Kawhi Leonard in the middle of the 2nd round, Paul George in the middle of the 3rd, no longer teammates, of course, aged Jimmy Butler in the 4th, Jared Allen in the 5th round, who I actually think is a really nice, safe play there, regardless of format, Julius Randle in the 6th, Anthony Simons in the 7th, Jalen Suggs in the 8th, Jonas Valanciunas in the 9th, Mike Conley in the 10th, Clint Capella in the 11th, Alex Sarr in the 12th, and Andrew Nembhard in the 13th. I feel like drafts can kind of be broken up into like a first 4 because that's kind of your core. And we were laughing about it a little bit before we hit record, that your core is you said, and I quote, I drafted 4 of the same guy. So is this, thinking through it like head-to-head or Roto, honestly, I'm interested in your strategic thoughts on both. Is that something you end up doing more in Roto or more in head-to-head, and it just sort of like translated over here because a bunch of aging dudes who can outperform their per-game side all fell into your lap? Like, how did this core of defensive, efficient wings end up as your team?
It started when I had to decide on the 2nd round pick in Kawhi Leonard. I was like, this is going to go one of 2 ways. I can try to, because building around SGA, I think is a bit interesting because like, while he's great in points and steals and blocks relative to his position, he doesn't do anything else particularly great, right? Like good field goal percentage, but I can make that up. And so I was like, what blends well with that? So let me just keep going with guys that can get at least 5 rebounds, 5 assists, and a steal that shoot a high field goal percentage. Because I feel like if I can corner that market, based on the way that the draft was going, I was like, I think I'm going to have values fall to me of guys that probably aren't that attractive because of their injury history, but would be perfect for my build. And so that's how I kind of like, it started with Kawhi Leonard, then that led directly into Paul George. I'm like, why is he still there? Obviously take him. Following around, I was like, if Jimmy Butler makes it back to me, I have to do it. And then before I knew it, I was like, holy shit, I just did. I executed it effectively. This worked. And like, it's funny because Julius Randle came up in the 6th round. And like, initially when I did, I was like, I'm not really feeling Julius Randle this year. But now, like,
this is pre-trade, by the way. We did this draft pre-trade.
Yeah. Right. But I actually kind of like it for where he's at now. I think his usage would have been squeezed a little bit more in New York, and I think he's going to be pissed off. So I actually like Julius Randle now, and if you look at his ADP, I mean, it's pretty modest considering what he could do with this new Minnesota Timberwolves team. So, yeah, I think where the one lacking part you'll notice within my first 6 to actually you can go through the first 8 rounds, there's like no blocks potential there. So I wasn't actively trying to block or to punt blocks, but if you see in my later round picks, I tried to correct that a little bit, but that's definitely my weakest point on my team is probably blocks and probably threes too. Once I drafted Shai, Kawhi, Paul, Jimmy, like, there's not much 3-point competency there. But I think I'm really strong in at least 4 or 5 categories, which is kind of what the goal was there. And then just try to be as competitive as can be in the ones that I'm deficient.
Yeah, it's a really interesting team build to be in sort of like a not great blocks, not great threes combo, because you've got like one traditional big man stat your team is not super strong at, and you've got one traditional guard stat that your team isn't super strong at. But it makes sense when you look at who you've drafted because it's 4 wings, basically.
Right,
you didn't take a big man or a guard really through the first. I mean, I know Shai is a guard, but he's not sort of your traditional.
His stats don't translate as a guard, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Is this, and that, again, this is why I love the strategy side of things. I know in Roto, typically there's a moment where you're like, oh, crap, I got to address these things. I don't want to be bottom of the pack in multiple categories. If this was a head-to-head league, let's just for a minute say that you took all of these very old guys at the beginning. I know you wouldn't. No one would or should because missed games kill you in head-to-head. But let's just say hypothetically, this was a team that we were building together. You and I fought daily, and I convinced you to take old dudes every single time, and you're very mad at me about it, but this is how the story goes. What would you have done after that 4th pick if this was head-to-head versus what did you end up doing in Roto?
So
like head-to-head, would you just
I
call it a
picked,
day on blocks or threes or something?
yeah, I think in head to head, I definitely would have continued. I probably would just leaned into it more. And then instead of my back end picks being like, let me see who I had there.
I
Instead
can
of going like
squeeze out
Clint
a little.
Capella and Andrew Nemhard, I probably would have gone more 3-centric guys. Like, so if Klay Thompson was on the board in a certain round, I probably would have been prioritizing him to kind of get that boost. Dante DiVincenzo would have been another person that I probably would have prioritized if trying to fill that void. I probably wouldn't have picked Mike Conley because I think he just kind of fits into what I was already doing with like the 5 assists, a steal, good peripherals for the most part. Trying to think here. So the one pick that I was actually debating the most was I was going to pick Jalen Durant, and I picked Jared Allen. I think that was the one pick that I was like, because I really like Jared. I really like Jalen Durant this year, but I think for what I was building, I think I have a higher floor with Jared Allen based off where I was drafting. So that's what I went with there. And you can see I didn't take much risk. So this was a very conservative, risk averse team outside of just like the not playing games thing, but it's saying in terms of like, I didn't really go for many young guys. My team is probably one of the older ones in the league.
Yeah, you're giving me a run for my money in that one.
Yeah. My average age has got to be at least 30 plus, like for
yeah,
sure.
I think I may have overtaken you when you went Sar in the 12th, and I took Kentavious Caldwell Pope. That's where I caught you in team age. What is your again talking to Dan Titus of Yahoo Fantasy? What is your general strategy in head-to-head? Do you go into a draft expecting to punt? Do you kind of see how far you can get without looking at a punt? This is actually the question that is starting to almost drive every conversation I have of like, how long do people feel like they can go without deciding on what their team is going to be?
Yeah, and I think it's based off of the first pick that you have, because I think you're going to build your team differently when you have like a Giannis and a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Typically, I want to pick where I can get one of the top guards, because guards, my general philosophy is like I try not to punt, because I think when you try to think too hard, you start overcorrecting and possibly overfitting for what your situation is and what you think that you need. And so my general philosophy in any fantasy sport that I play is balance. So I try to get the guards that can do points, threes, assists, shoot a high free throw percentage. And then I get the bigs that shoot high field goal percentage, can score, get rebounds and blocks. And then that leaves the variable of turnovers, which that tends to be the category that I care about the least. It's pretty variable depending on which guards you get and which big men that you have. You can have low turnover big men, you can have high turnover big men. So I try to ignore turnovers the most and then focus on the 8 categories and then balancing each round for who fits that criteria the most. So if I go guard, maybe I go big next to kind of balance that out. Maybe I'll go 3 guard heavy and then go 2 bigs. That's kind of how I try to structure my first 5 rounds, because that's really the core basis of your team. So 3 guard front, 2 bigs, or I tend to not go 3 bigs and 2 guards. I think that's too late to get into the guard market for the high variance of the assists. So I usually start 2 to 3 guards and then go 2 big men.
Does that force you? Not, I don't say force you. Does that tend to cause you to lean away from someone like Giannis, where it is very hard to make up for his deficiency?
Yeah, I'll often, like in certain cases, I'll skip over that guy and get the next guy up that I know. Trae Young, I think, is a perfect example of that, where if I have like the 7th or 8th pick, Giannis might be sitting right there and it's him or Tatum. I might go Trae Young just because I know I want to get points, assist, high free throw percentage, steal. His steals are questionable, but
yeah, they showed up for a year.
But I think on the back end, on the turn of that, I can match him with another guard or potentially big man. We'll see. I think I moved Chet. Chet's a guy that moved a little bit further down in my rankings. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's a really fun way to build. And then you don't have to think about like, I just feel like nowadays people are trying to get too cute with, hey, let me build this this roster that, I'm punting this and I'm punting that. When you have so much baked in, you're like losing from the jump. So like, why would you want to get at a disadvantage in anywhere? Like, I get the theory of, yes, your strength, you have more strengths in other categories as a result of that. But I just think it becomes more difficult to manage your team, because especially if you have an injury that you weren't predicting, like that could throw off all of your numbers that you were projecting in the first place. So I go for balance. I think that's the best way, most consistent way to not make mistakes in your draft. And then also just don't draft injured players. Like,
yes,
start with the highest floor you can. If you hear the guy's hurt, I know you may have an injury stash, but get the guys that can produce right away. Like,
yeah, you got to get off to a quick start. If you take a guy who's hurt out of the gate and someone else on your team gets hurt and you've used up your injured slots, you are absolutely. And plus, if you get off to a good start, you can think about stashing later in the year. You just have all these avenues that open up if you're not starting behind the other teams. And I actually, like, my basic philosophy for this podcast, I'm so glad you brought up the concept of balance, is to simplify fantasy basketball for people who, you and I are staring at it for 14 hours a day. Everybody else that's playing it shouldn't have to do that much to be pretty damn good at it. Like,
right.
We want to be in the 99.9 percentile. You guys, listeners, viewers, whatever, you guys can be like 95th percentile doing a very, very small fraction of what we do. And then every percentage point after that takes tens, hundreds of hours to get to. And so what Dan Titus is saying here is basically, look, make your life simple. Don't look at these guys and go, oh, well, if I punt this, if I punt that, then it fits in just like this. Because by the time you get to the fourth round, you may have whittled your target list down to like 7 guys the rest of the draft. And if you don't get those guys, you're going to look at your team at the end and go, uh-oh, like my team's good at 4 categories right now and just crap at 5. How did I let this happen? Well, you built a team where you had to get Julius Randle and you didn't get Julius Randle. And then you're left reaching very early. And I get it. If you're in a hyper competitive head-to-head league, you basically have to punt something because you're not going to get all of your targets.
Right.
But most of our readers, listeners, viewers, whatever, aren't in leagues with a ton of other fantasy experts doing 100 hours a week on it. Most of you are in leagues with friends, with coworkers, whatever, people that you want to stomp, but are doing, an hour a week or something like that. So draft a really good team. If you can, I think Josh might have said it, if you can just draft a guy who's like a round better than where you got him at every juncture along the way, you're going to have a pretty damn good
team. Yeah. You have a pretty good team.
Dan, I want to ask just one last question, maybe the most important one. What are you working on right now? Let's do some promo.
Oh man, what aren't I doing? So yeah, go to yahoo.com, fantasy basketball. Make sure you get in your mock drafts. I can't implore anybody enough to just practice your draft strategy, whatever that strategy is, before you get into the draft room. Going to have my draft kit coming out pretty soon. That will be updated with the ranks and the tiers. Also, the draft blueprint for fantasy basketball, for Yahoo Fantasy Basketball, which is going to be really fun. My creative juices will be flowing a little bit. I have some really cool graphics. Shout out to my team for that. I'm really excited about that. It'll just pretty much be my manifesto of everything I think about fantasy basketball and how I'm approaching drafts. So read that, check it out. And all things at yahoofantasy.com.
I was trying to throw some sort of Yahoo Fantasy thing up on the screen while you were talking, and I sort of doinked it. But people can see
what is this random ad of this dog here?
I know. Like, there we go. I got the research page up, and then it's like, buy, what is this, pet meds? How did you know, computer? How did you know my dog needs thyroid medicine? Damn you. Damn you all. Dan, you are the man. Can we do this one more time before the season starts, or maybe right after, or get that like right at the beginning of the season? Here's the crazy stuff that happened.
Absolutely. And don't be surprised if there's another rankings update. You can have me on right after that so we can dissect what the hell changed, what went wrong, what went right, all that in between.
So I can yell at you for moving Chris Paul back inside the top 100. You finally dropped him far enough where I'm like, yes, I'm going to get an old guy again. And I just know it. I remember last year, and then again, I got to let you go. I think the last draft board dropped like 4 days before the season started. It was like right before that last weekend, I think, right?
Yeah, I think it was.
And I had all my drafts that last weekend, and the board dropped, and I went, no! And every target that I had, like all the maps I had planned out were just poof in an instant. And I didn't send you an angry message. But this year I will. I'll do it publicly so everyone can see it. Dan Titus of Yahoo Fantasy. Dan, you are the man. Thank you so much for coming on.
No problem, Dan. Anytime.
I love hanging out with Dan Titus. I screwed up the video edit again. There was a brief pause there that makes no sense for anybody, but whatever. Just blame that on me and my technological non-know-how. But Dan's the man. And it's so cool to be able to talk to somebody who sees the stuff going on behind the scenes with these Yahoo boards and why things are happening and why players are moving in a particular way. And we got some explanations on some of the biggest leapers as I'm being attacked by a small moth. They are, I think they are reproducing in an old golf bag I have sitting in the corner of the room. And every once in a while, I didn't get him. Thought I got him. I'm going to ignore him now. And we're going to wrap this bad boy up. So those are some of the biggest changes on the Yahoo Revision 3 board. Dan's thoughts on how to draft in fantasy, roto, head-to-head, whatever, and some of the players and things that risks that he's willing to take in some formats versus others. Again, when that next Yahoo board drops, we're going to get Dan back on the show. For now, thank you all for listening. I'm Dan Besbris. He's Dan Titus for Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Have an amazing Friday. We will be back with you guys. Weekend episodes continue here in the run-up to the season, and we'll get at you tomorrow. So long for now.